Welcome, everybody. Today, we're focusing on a really interesting topic. We're looking at a more ethical focused topic, which is around informed consent in genetic testing. And I'm super lucky to have the very wise and knowledgeable Dr. Lisa Dive joining me today. Lisa is a bioethics academic with a philosophy background, and she has a lot of expertise in researching the ethical elements of genetics and genomics. And she also teaches ethics and research in the UTS Genetic Counseling program. So, welcome, Lisa. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Ali.
So, Lisa and I have crossed paths many times, I guess probably in the last 5 years or so, most notably because we both worked on Mackenzie's mission. And Lisa played a really important role in looking into the ethical aspects of reproductive genetic carrier screening. So as I mentioned, I've invited Lisa along today to talk about informed consent in genetic testing. So I guess I'll launch in, Lisa. You've spent obviously a lot of time thinking about ethics and genetics. And I wondered if you could start by explaining what is informed consent and why is it important when we think about it in the context of genetic testing?
Okay. Oh, I don't have really a definition of informed consent to hand, but I guess I
Mm,
would explain it as it's a process by which someone can understand what a genetic test is going to mean for them
mm,
and decide if they want to have it or not and agree
mhm,
to it, if that's what they want. Yeah. And I think that in genetics, informed consent is really important because genetic information is one kind of healthcare information. There is this whole debate whether it should have a special and different category of its own. And I'm not quite sure about that myself. But I think what we can say about genetic information is it is very complex. It often is a bit, or has actually can be very uncertain. It can have lots of different kinds of uncertainty. It can be probabilistic. It can be not quite clear what a genetic test result means for the health of that person. So, because it's quite complex, it's important for people to understand what a genetic test might do for them or what they might get out of doing a genetic test in order to make a decision about whether that test is right for them. And in terms of ethics, the way that I think about ethics is it's about what we ought to do and why. And so thinking about we want to do things for the right reasons. So we want to reflect, we want our decisions, like agreeing to a genetic test, to align with what kind of a life we want and the values that we have and those kinds of things. In terms of genetic testing, informed consent is a process that people can go through with a healthcare professional to help them think about whether the test is going to help them in some way and it's going to give them something which is going to be of value to them.
mm. And I think it's really interesting just spending some time stopping and thinking about this concept because when people come into genetic testing, often prior to that, their experience of testing for a medical or a health reason is a yes or no answer.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think quite often people are thinking they're going to get a yes or no answer from genetic information. You're either a carrier or you're not, you either have the condition or you're not. But as you've alluded to, there's actually quite a lot of grey areas that can come from the genetic information that you can gain.
Yeah.
And so that's often why we try and step people through the process, because what we don't want is for someone to come out the other end and go, hang on a minute, I didn't realize I was going to get information like this. This isn't actually very
Yeah,
helpful for me. Mm,
exactly. Yeah.
mm,
And I think that's a real challenge in genetic testing because there are so many different outcomes from a genetic test, depending on the test, of course, but there can be so many different outcomes. It's often impossible to explain them all to a person who is thinking of having that test. So finding ways to convey that complexity and relate it to what the person is hoping to achieve from having the test.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are some common outcomes, and then there can be some less common outcomes, and then there can be some
Mm.
super rare but possible outcomes from the
Yeah.
testing. And absolutely, when you're thinking about how do I explain this test to someone, you're also having to go through and go, I can't overload people with this information.
Yeah.
So I've got to prioritize what I tell people. But then you
Mm.
also want to prepare them for the possibility of getting something unexpected as well. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So When we think of informed consent, ultimately we're thinking about someone signing a piece of paper saying, I understand what I'm doing here. But what does informed decision making look like in genetic testing? And how would you know if you've made a good decision or an informed decision?
Yeah. So I think when people think of informed consent, I think, like you said, you think of the form that they sign at the end and all the information that they got. And we often have this sort of intuitive metaphor of information as something that can be transferred from one person to another. So you've got the health professional who has all this information, who then transfers the information to the patient, who then uses that information to make a decision, which I think that's a bit of an unhelpful way of thinking about it, because I like to think about informed consent as a process, a communication process, an interaction where I think a good decision like you asked what a good decision making process looks like. I think it has to be really adapted. It depends on the person. So it depends on, we all have different kinds of preferences for the amount of detail that we might want.
Mm,
Some
yep.
people really are, we think of some people as information seekers who want all the technical information that they really want to delve into that in a great deal of depth. And some people just really don't want that at all. They just want to do what their healthcare professional thinks is the
Mm,
best thing for them to do. So having that conversation, adapting that process so that a person feels like they really understand what the test might mean for them. And like you say, the possible array of outcomes and which might be more likely than others. I think that those are really important elements. And something that I think is really important, always to keep in mind, what is the purpose of the genetic test at the end of the day?
mm,
What is the person hoping to achieve? So that's linking back to any kind of an ethical decision ultimately comes back to how is this going to contribute to a good or a flourishing life? So is this test potentially going to give the person information which is going to be valuable, that's going to benefit them and improve their life at the end of the day?
yeah, I love that way of thinking about it. As you were talking, I was thinking back to so earlier on in my career, non invasive prenatal testing had just come out, and we had
Mm.
started at the service that I was working with at the time, had just started offering it. And I remember initially we decided that every patient needed to come in to our clinic and have a face to face appointment with a genetic counsellor to
Yeah.
go through what NIPT meant and what all the potential outcomes were. And it was just so interesting because quite a large proportion of people would come in and you would sit down with them and you would talk to them about NIPT and they'd be going, yep. And you felt like they were just going, just give me the test. I get it.
Mm.
Just give
Yeah.
me the test.
Yeah.
And you almost felt like you were pushing these people through this barrier, like you were creating a
Mm.
barrier for them.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so what the description that you were just providing feels much more like a flexible, adaptable kind of process when you talk about this being a communication process and an
Mm.
interaction. So it's more
Yeah.
of a dance where you're understanding how the person is feeling, what kind of information they want, and how engaged they want to be in the process.
Yeah.
And that feels a lot more
Exactly.
natural to me than my early days as a genetic counselor when I felt like I had to sit there and go through all these points and
Yeah.
push people to go through all these points when they
Mm.
really didn't want to do it and they were just like, give me the test, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really
Yeah.
interesting. So I guess you touched on earlier the fact that genetic information can be complex and uncertain. And I guess I just wondered what you think about how we sort of balance supporting individual autonomy whilst acknowledging the sort of broader implications of the genetic test. Obviously, the genetic test can have implications for the individual, but it
Mhm.
can be more complex than that because it can have implications for the broader family.
Yeah.
And so, how do we navigate that element that it's not just a test for one person, it's almost a test that is for the family as well?
Yeah, that is a really tricky one. The concept of the process of informed consent is very connected with the concept you mentioned of autonomy, which is one of the foundational concepts of clinical healthcare. And we think of it, what initially when autonomy came to be a very prominent concept, we thought of it as an individual thing. But More and more now we think of autonomy as a relationally situated capacity that people have to direct their own lives in accordance with their values and preferences. So a person in exercising their autonomy and in as a healthcare professional, supporting your patient to foster their autonomy and make an autonomous decision that aligns with their values, we have to factor in not only their own individual preferences and needs and so on, but also thinking about their family context. And so that this sort of relationality of autonomy is something that is, I think, quite relevant to genetics. And again, I think it comes back to always thinking about what the person is likely to get out of the test and helping them to understand the potential implications. I like to think about the utility, like the usefulness of a test.
Yep.
And that might be for the individual, but it might also be, it might also have utility for their family members as well. So that's something that's really important, I think, to talk about as part of that consent process.
Yeah, it almost seems like just listening to your response, it makes me think, oh, like even my framing of it initially, the individual versus the
Mm.
collective is it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And it also made me think, I guess there's not just the family context, but the social context and the
Mm.
cultural context
Yeah.
as well. And
Mm.
so autonomy might differ depending on those contexts.
Yeah. The social context is really important because that provides the context for a lot of our kind of value judgments and preferences. So if you think about prenatal or testing, genetic testing in the sort of reproductive and prenatal context, a lot of people's ideas about what they want in a test like that are shaped by sort of social norms, ideas
Mm,
about what kind of a family they would prefer or they envisage for themselves and those kinds of things. Yeah,
mm.
so the social context matters a lot as well.
And what about the cultural context? Because I guess decision-making processes may differ depending on cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, in many cultures, there'll be much more involvement of family members in a decision making process like genetic testing, and also in the wider community. If there's elders in a community that people might consult with significant decisions, and then in other cultures, there might be more of an individualistic approach that we should each be entitled to make decisions about our own healthcare. Yeah, there's lots of different approaches. I think adapting the consent
Mm.
processes for those contexts can be really useful.
And what happens in situations where there are differences in opinions about accessing a genetic test or obtaining genetic information? How do we balance the different perspectives?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. And probably yourself as a genetic counselor
Yeah.
would be better to ask than me. Is that
Yeah.
my engagement with it is more at the theoretical level. If you think about things like utility and you think about the various harms and benefits of different courses of action,
Mm,
if you are, obviously privacy and confidentiality of a patient is
mm,
a professional obligation that many healthcare professionals will have. But then if there's a risk of significant harm to a third person, there might be some justification for not necessarily breaching that confidentiality, but really suggesting that the person disclose that information to their relative if it has the potential to benefit them. So I think, yeah, that sort of weighing of harms and benefits, a lot of the time, going back to that idea of what is a good decision,
mm,
often there isn't a clear best decision. Sometimes in really hard choices, there seem to be lots of not great options that all have
mm,
significant problems with them. But I think the important thing is to think through what is an important, like either what kind of an outcome do we want, what do we think are the important considerations here, and really justify the course of action. Feel or come to a come to a decision where we feel that course of action is really well justified by something like a trading off different harms and benefits against each other or something like that. And they will be often there'll be different parties, different maybe family members or community members
mm.
who will have different interests in a particular decision making process.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense thinking about it as you've described about the utility of the information. I know I've mostly spoken about the prenatal context, but these apply across these concepts apply across genomics. But sometimes in the prenatal context, you can get really difficult choices that people have to make. And I'm interested to know what you think about this. At some point, I came up with this phrase in my own sort of head, which was sometimes people end up in a situation where they have to make what I call the least worst decision.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I think that's a really
yeah,
useful way of thinking about it. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know that's like wonderful English to call it the least worst decision, but sometimes it can be that kind of
Mm.
situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But the important thing to do is to have reasoned through the different options
Mm.
in order to find out which is the least worst option. I think that's actually a really useful way of thinking about particularly very hard, challenging decisions.
Yeah, for genetic counselors, dealing with situations where people are making really difficult decisions, or also there are decisions that might impact other members of the family, that is
Mm.
actually something that is bread and butter for genetic counselors, like
Yeah,
as you allude
absolutely.
to. And genetic counselors, we do find these situations really tricky as well. But usually, if you can work through it with a person and unpack it and unpack why they feel uncomfortable about having a genetic test and having to disclose a result to a family member, or not wanting to disclose a result to a family member. And if you can actually build the rapport and you can sit with them and you can understand what's behind their discomfort or uncertainty about a situation, usually you can help them step through it and you can gently challenge some of their perceptions and even assumptions that they've made and help them come up with a course of action. And sometimes it's just that people feel overwhelmed by having to have a difficult conversation
Hmm.
and they're worried about how that's going to make them feel and how that's going to make other people feel. And so if you can talk them through that and you can empower them and give them a bit of encouragement and create a space where they feel a bit more confident and like that they have a few more tools to help them in having those discussions, usually
Mm.
people can overcome the barriers that they think might be there in terms of sharing genetic information with relatives or not, or whether or not they want to have a genetic test and what sort of influence other people's views are having on that.
Yeah, I love that the way you describe that process. It's when I talk to my students about when you've got some people who might have maybe family members who have like conflicting views about whether to have a genetic test. It's that exploring their underlying reasons for it. Often people will have, I call it hidden assumptions or hidden premises in a logical
Mm,
argument for why they hold a particular view that they should or someone should or should not have a test. By uncovering those underlying reasons, I think you can do a number of really helpful things. As you
mm,
described, I think sometimes there'll be factual misunderstandings, which I think obviously genetic counselors are really, or other clinicians are really well placed to clarify. But also, what I think is great in terms of exploring those underlying reasons is that often you can find common ground, like shared values, that
mm,
family members tend to often have each other's best interests at heart. And so by finding shared values, like they both, or many different people can both hope for the same end outcome, but they
mm.
envisage different ways of getting there, perhaps because of some misunderstandings or some of those other complex factors of resistances that you talked about. So I think that's, yeah, those kinds of exploratory conversations can be really useful.
One of the challenges I see, and I see this in clinical practice quite a lot, is that there's a bit of a difference between how it could or should work and how it actually does work in practice.
Mm,
What do you
okay.
think the biggest gaps are? And what can we do to overcome them? And what do practitioners need to be aware of in overcoming some of those gaps?
Yeah, look, I mean, first, I don't have any exposure to clinical work, so I'm probably
Yeah.
not the best person to
Yeah.
answer this. But I think from what I hear, I work with a lot of clinical colleagues like
Yes,
yourself
exactly.
and
Yeah.
others. And from what sort of makes intuitive sense as well, one of the biggest challenges is just giving people adequate time and space to really grapple with the potential implications of genetic testing. And that also to have the flexibility to adapt the consent process to make it meaningful for each different person according to what they need out of it, I guess. Can be very administratively heavy, I think, lots of forms. And I think that maybe encourages people just to tune out and tick boxes and not really reflect on whether having a genetic test aligns with their values and is actually going to be a benefit to them.
I think you're absolutely spot on. In my experience, particularly dealing with health professionals who are not genetics trained health professionals, but they're offering genetic testing, they're
Mm.
often offering it in the context where they're quite time poor and they've got lots of
Mm.
conflicting priorities. And
Yeah.
so the space hasn't been created to enable that communication process as you
Yeah.
describe it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess projecting forward and thinking to the future, do you have any thoughts on what can be done in terms of improving the clinical context or the situations in which consent conversations can happen to better enable people to have the opportunity to make informed decisions?
Yeah, look, I think there's actually great potential in a range of different kinds of technological approaches to
Mm,
support a consent process which is between human beings. So I think
mhm,
not outsourcing consent to an AI bot or something, but I think using digital tools like perhaps a chatbot, or we are familiar, of course, with the excellent decision aid that was developed as part of Mackenzie's mission.
mm,
I think that's such a great example where a group of experts from all different disciplines developed this decision aid that presented information in a really accessible way. It was flexible and allowed people to drill down to the amount of detail that they preferred. And it also prompted them to reflect on their values in relation to the test or the carrier screening that they were considering taking up an offer of. So I think those kinds of tools, perhaps as a precursor to an in-person consent process, so that the patient who comes in to actually provide their consent to take a genetic test, they will have already had some information, they will have engaged with it, maybe reflected on potential outcomes and what they might mean for them. So then that consent conversation can really be focused on the kind of values alignment and the utility of that test for that person without having to spend so much time providing all that detail that a person might need.
Yeah, it's great to hear you mention the Mackenzie's Mission Decision Aid because you're absolutely right. And that was a great example. The qualitative data that came out of that really showed that often it didn't actually alter people's decision about whether they wanted to have reproductive carrier screening, but they
Mm.
had a lot more confidence coming out the other end having used the decision aid. And one totally unexpected finding that we had was that often with carrier screening and most reproductive screening, it's the female reproductive partner who really has to drive the process. But with reproductive genetic carrier screening delivered the way it was in Mackenzie's mission, whereas a reproductive couple based screen, the male reproductive partner needed to do their own enrollment into the study and
Mhm.
they went through the decision aid separately.
Yeah.
And so when we interviewed people after about their decision making experiences after they'd done the decision aid, what we found is that the decision aid not only prompted the individual each in their own brains to think
Mm.
about what the result would mean for them and what the process would mean
Mm.
for them, but they actually came out of it at the end and talked to each other about how they responded in the decision aid. And they
Mhm.
said, what was this? They told our interviewer about how they'd said to each other, "Oh, what did you put for that question? And what did you put for that?" And "Oh, I put this. Oh, is this how you feel about if this situation comes up for us in a
Mm.
pregnancy? Is this how you feel about it? I thought you would have thought this way, but you didn't." And what it did was it not only encouraged people to think more deeply about the test, but it also was like almost like an intervention for the couple. It brought them together and made them more
Mm.
united. And it encouraged them to have conversations about underlying beliefs and values that would sit behind their own individual decision making.
Yeah.
And so it functioned as this intervention in its own right. And it brought
Mm.
the male partner into the picture and allowed
Yeah.
them to be more actively involved. That was
That's
a lovely
fantastic. Yeah.
example. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess another thing I was thinking as you were talking is that I've heard some people who use AI scribe technology
Mm.
talking about how not having to worry about sitting there writing notes while you're talking to a patient in the
Mhm.
consult actually enables you to do more of the human component of care.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, is that something that you've come across in your work?
I haven't really engaged a lot with that aspect of the way that AI is used. I think the main things to think about, obviously, is the security of the systems and the confidentiality and all those kinds of things in that kind of
Mm,
setting. But yeah, I can definitely see it's like the information provision. If you can get a chatbot to do a lot of this is what carrier screening means, or explaining the genetic test, explaining potential results, and so on, it frees up any way that you can free up the human to have a more
mm.
human interaction, I think is going to be a good thing.
So I guess leading on from that, one of the things we're really focused on with this GenoCare podcast is thinking forward and thinking about the future. And I guess what we're seeing more and more is genetic testing's becoming more mainstream. And so in that mainstreaming process, we're going to be delivering, or we already are in some situations, delivering genetic testing at scale. And so I'm
Mm.
interested in your thoughts, and I guess it's an expansion on the answers you've already given, but how do we scale the informed consent process? What does that look like so that it's still done in an ethically responsible way, but it's done for a much larger volume of people?
Yeah, I think scaling it obviously with digital tools would be the obvious way to do that. But I think that the key really is to use the digital tools in a really cautious way. Think about what their role is, what aspects of the consent process can't be outsourced to a digital tool, and then using it, connecting in with the human element where it's most effective, where you can get the most, where the human interaction is really crucial, so that you're not replacing those key parts, but using scalable digital tools where appropriate, integrated into the decision-making process.
Yep, yep, makes perfect sense. So I guess that's been obviously a really fascinating discussion. And I think, yeah, it's changed my perspective in terms of I love thinking about it more as this sort of much more flexible, adaptive kind of process rather than a
Mhm.
structured, you must understand all of these components. I guess just to finish off, if you could change one thing about how we approach consent and decision making and genetic testing right now, what would it be?
Look, I don't think that this is necessarily a change. I think from
Hmm.
my discussions with clinicians who I work with, I think they're probably doing it this way anyway. But I think framing the conversations in relation to the utility of the information that we're going to get from a genetic test is really important, because I think as a society, we're very prone to defaulting to the more information is better, knowledge is power, those kinds of things. A lot of people think in those kinds of ways. And like you said, with other medical, health and medical tests, you'll often always say yes to a test because, yes, you want more information about your health, of course. But if that information might be really complex and uncertain, and you're not sure what you're going to do with it or what it might mean for either yourself or your family members, approaching it with a bit more caution. So, really focusing on that utility, the value, the usefulness of that information that a person might get from a genetic test and how that might serve them in living a better life ultimately.
And so if we think back to when I was talking at the beginning about when NIPT came in and we were seeing
Mm.
everyone face to face for consults, and I was getting these people who were just like, yes,
Yeah.
NIPT can throw up some complex type results. And I guess in my own experience, but also in the research that we've done, we see that some of the results that people struggle with the most are sex chromosome aneuploidy results, where you get
Mm.
extra or missing copies of the sex chromosomes, because those conditions can be quite a lot milder than some of the other conditions that come up on NIPT. And
Yeah.
people can often find decision making about those results really complex. So that's a nice
Mm.
example of why you do want to slow people down a little bit in that consent process and
Mm.
encourage a dynamic where they are thinking about it a little bit more.
Yeah. And just
Yeah.
prompting them to reflect on, if you had this kind of an uncertain result, what would that mean to you? What would you do with that? And having those conversations, particularly in the reproductive context, between the family members who are making that decision.
And what are your thoughts on health professionals that not trained in genetics or genetic testing, but ordering genetic testing? What are some sort of key takeaways for them in terms of how to help support their patients make
Yeah.
informed decisions, particularly when they're in that situation where they've got lots of competing priorities and not much time? What are
Yeah.
the sort of, are there any kind of fundamental or sort of key things that they can do?
Oh, yeah. Look, this is a hard question. And we are seeing, of course, more and more mainstreaming of genetic testing. So it's an important thing to think about. I think just being really clear about the potential value of the test and being able to have that conversation if you have any. And I think, again, supporting non-genetic healthcare professionals to offer genetic testing. This is where, again, digital solutions, technological support might be really valuable. Having high quality information at their fingertips in relation to what are the possible outcomes of the test, what might the value of it be, what might be some of the more challenging type of results that might come. Being able to have those conversations with confidence, I think, is really important.
Amazing. Is there anything else that I haven't asked about that you think I should on this topic? Have I missed anything?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate your insights today. And it's definitely given me some things to think about in terms of informed consent. And I think we're at a really interesting time where these shifts in technology are creating opportunities for us to think differently about how we offer genetic testing and
Mm,
potentially utilize some of the digital technology to remove the standardized repetitive components, but still, as you say, really importantly, ensure that we have the human components of care still there and
yeah.
able for people to access. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks,
All right.
Sally.